The Tuesday afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of the community center at Riverside Gardens, casting warm patches of light across the polished wooden floor. A small crowd had gathered in the main hall, their excited chatter bouncing off the walls. Something new had arrived, and in a place where routine was the norm, anything new was cause for celebration. At the center of all the attention sat a magnificent grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the overhead lights. The instrument had been donated just that morning by a local music store that was closing down after 40 years in business. For most of the residents at Riverside Gardens, this piano represented possibility. For one woman standing quietly at the back of the room, it represented something far more complicated. Margaret Chen watched the scene unfold from her usual position near the wall. She had perfected the art of being present but invisible over the past 6 months. At 72, she had become someone who smiled when greeted, nodded politely during conversations, but rarely volunteered anything about herself. The other residents had long since stopped trying to pull her into activities. She was the nice lady in apartment 2B who kept to herself, and that seemed to suit everyone just fine. The piano sat there like a beautiful, silent invitation. Already, a few brave souls had taken their turns at the keys. Mr. Peterson from the 3rd floor had played a shaky version of Jingle Bells, even though it was only September. Mrs. Walsh had attempted something that might have been Für Elise, but gave up halfway through with a laugh and a shrug. A younger woman named Linda, who worked at the front desk, played a cheerful pop song that got a few people clapping along. Everyone was having fun. The mood in the room was light, joyful even. People were laughing at the mistakes, applauding the efforts, enjoying this unexpected break in their daily routine. Margaret kept her face neutral. But inside, something was stirring. Something she had kept buried for so long that she had almost convinced herself it no longer existed. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. She pressed them against her thighs, willing them to be still. She shouldn't even be here. When she had heard about the piano delivery this morning, she should have stayed in her apartment. She should have found something else to do, somewhere else to be. But her feet had carried her down here anyway, drawn by a force she didn't want to name. The crowd was beginning to thin now. People were drifting away, heading back to their apartments or to the dining room where afternoon coffee was being served. The initial excitement had worn off, and the piano would soon be sitting alone, waiting for its next curious visitor. Margaret told herself to leave. She told herself to turn around and walk away, just as she had walked away from pianos in shopping malls, in hotel lobbies, in music stores for the past 50 years. But she didn't move. A young woman approached her. Her name was Katie, and she was one of the activities coordinators at Riverside Gardens. She had kind eyes and an easy smile, and she had tried several times over the past months to get Margaret involved in book clubs, art classes, and social gatherings. Each time, Margaret had politely declined. "Mrs. Chen?" Katie's voice was gentle. "Would you like to try? There's no pressure at all. Most of us can barely play a scale, so anything sounds good to us." Margaret looked at Katie, then back at the piano. Her throat felt tight. "Oh, I don't know. I haven't played in many years." "That's okay," Katie encouraged. "It's just for fun. Mr. Peterson couldn't remember half the notes to his song, and we all loved it anyway." There was something about Katie's genuine warmth that made it hard to refuse. Or maybe Margaret was just tired of refusing, tired of running from something that had once meant everything to her. She found herself nodding, though she wasn't sure she had actually decided to nod. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the piano bench. The few remaining residents watched with mild interest, expecting nothing more than another amateur attempt at a familiar tune. Margaret could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the piano. As she got closer, details came into focus. The ivory keys, slightly yellowed with age. The maker's name printed in elegant gold letters above the keyboard. the smooth wood of the bench, worn from years of use. She sat down slowly, taking her time to adjust the bench height. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them in her lap. The piano was real. The keys were real. This moment was happening, whether she was ready for it or not. Margaret lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. The coolness of the ivory against her fingertips sent a jolt through her entire body. It had been so long, so achingly, impossibly long. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't remember why she had stayed away for half a century. She pressed down on middle C. The note rang out, clear and pure. Then D. Then E. She played a simple C major scale, the kind that beginners practice on their first day of lessons. Her fingers moved carefully, deliberately, as if she were testing whether they still remembered how to do this at all. Behind her, she heard someone shifting their weight, the sound of a door closing in the distance, the hum of the air conditioning, normal sounds, ordinary sounds. She played a simple melody, something a child might learn in their first month of lessons. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, in its most basic form. Katie smiled, thinking this was the extent of Margaret's ability. She was already preparing a kind compliment, already thinking about how she would encourage this small step forward for the usually reserved woman. But then something happened. Margaret's fingers, which had been moving with careful uncertainty, suddenly found their rhythm. The simple melody shifted, evolved, transformed into something else entirely. Her left hand joined in, adding depth and harmony that hadn't been there a moment before. The beginner's tune melted away, replaced by the opening phrases of a piece that was anything but simple. The change was so sudden that Katie actually gasped. Her prepared compliment died on her lips. The few residents who had been about to leave stopped in their tracks and turned back toward the piano. Margaret's entire body had transformed. Her shoulders, which had been hunched and uncertain, now held a posture of absolute confidence. Her back straightened, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. And her fingers, those trembling fingers that had seemed so unsure just moments ago, now moved across the keys with breathtaking certainty. The music that poured from the piano was nothing like what had come before. This wasn't a cheerful pop song or a shaky attempt at a holiday tune. This was something else entirely. Something that made the air in the room feel different, heavier, more alive. People who had already left the room began to drift back in, pulled by the sound. Conversations in the hallway stopped mid-sentence. Someone in the dining room put down their coffee cup and stood up, following the music to its source. And Margaret played on, her eyes closed now, lost in something that was part memory, part muscle memory, and part pure feeling. The simple tune had been a test, a way to see if she could bear to touch these keys without falling apart. But now that her hands had remembered, now that the music had started to flow, there was no stopping it. The question wasn't whether she could still play. The question was why she had ever stopped. The notes cascaded from Margaret's fingers like water flowing over smooth stones, each phrase built on the last, growing in complexity and emotion. What had started as Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major was now being played with the kind of interpretation that textbooks tried to describe but could never quite capture. Katie stood frozen 3 feet from the piano, her mouth slightly open. She had worked at Riverside Gardens for 2 years and thought she knew all the residents reasonably well. She knew who had been teachers, who had run businesses, who had traveled the world. But this was something else entirely. The small crowd that had gathered was growing by the minute. Mrs. Walsh, who had fumbled through Für Elise just 20 minutes earlier, stood with tears streaming down her cheeks. Mr. Peterson had lowered himself into a nearby chair, shaking his head in disbelief. People were whispering to each other, asking if anyone knew about this. If anyone had any idea that the quiet woman from 2B could do this, no one had known, not a single person. Margaret's fingers danced through the difficult middle section of the nocturne, where the melody weaves in and out of intricate runs and arpeggios. Her touch was delicate where it needed to be, powerful where the music demanded it. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story, painting pictures, making the piano sing in a way that most people only heard in concert halls or on professional recordings. The piece came to its gentle conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like morning mist. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes still closed. She looked like someone who had just finished running a marathon, exhausted but somehow more alive than she had been before. Then the applause started. It wasn't the polite clapping that had followed the earlier attempts. This was real applause, the kind that came from genuine shock and appreciation. People were clapping hard. Some were calling out words of amazement. A few were still crying. Margaret's eyes opened slowly. She seemed confused by the sound, as if she had forgotten there were other people in the room. She turned slightly on the bench and saw the crowd that had gathered. There were at least 30 people now, maybe more. She blinked, clearly startled by how many had come. Her hands moved to her lap and she stood up quickly, too quickly. She looked like she wanted to run. The color had drained from her face and she swayed slightly. Katie rushed forward and gently took her arm. "Mrs. Chen, that was incredible," Katie said softly. "Are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" Margaret shook her head, though she did let Katie guide her to a chair away from the piano. People were crowding around now, all talking at once. Where did she learn to play like that? Had she been a music teacher? Why had she never mentioned this before? Margaret sat in the chair, her hands gripping the armrests. She looked overwhelmed by all the attention, all the questions. Katie, sensing this, held up her hand to quiet everyone down. "Let's give Mrs. Chen some space," Katie said firmly but kindly. "That was a lot, and I think she needs a moment." Most people stepped back, though they continued to watch Margaret with new eyes. This wasn't the invisible woman who walked the halls anymore. This was someone who had just revealed herself to be extraordinary, and no one knew quite what to make of it. Katie brought Margaret a glass of water. Margaret took it with shaking hands and drank slowly. After a few minutes, the immediate crowd began to disperse, though people kept glancing back as they left. The whispers would continue for hours, spreading through the entire building. By dinner time, everyone would know what had happened. When most people had gone, Katie pulled up a chair next to Margaret. She didn't pepper her with questions. She just sat there, waiting, giving the older woman space to breathe and recover. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause such a fuss." "You don't need to apologize," Katie said gently. "That was beautiful, really beautiful. I've never heard anything like that in person before." Margaret nodded but didn't say anything else. She stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Have you been playing your whole life?" Katie asked carefully. "Once," Margaret said after a long pause. "A long time ago. Were you a teacher?" Margaret's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, not a teacher." Katie waited, hoping Margaret would continue, but the older woman had retreated back into herself. She could see the walls going up again, brick by brick. Whatever door had opened when Margaret sat down at that piano was starting to close. But Katie couldn't let it go. What she had just witnessed wasn't just someone who had taken piano lessons as a child. This was something much more. The way Margaret had played, the emotion she had drawn from the instrument, the technical mastery that was obvious even to someone with limited musical knowledge, it all pointed to something significant. "Mrs. Chen," Katie said slowly, "I don't want to push you, but what you just did was special. Really special. People who play like that usually have a story. Margaret looked up at her then. Her eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen. Everyone has a story, she said quietly. Most of them aren't very interesting. I think yours might be, Katie replied. For a long moment, Margaret just looked at her. Then she looked back at the piano, which sat silent across the room, waiting. Something in her expression shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Katie saw it. It was the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they could put it down. It was a very long time ago, Margaret said finally. Another life. Before I came to this country, before I got married, before everything changed. Katie leaned forward slightly. What happened? Margaret was quiet for so long that Katie thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so soft Katie had to strain to hear it, Margaret said, I used to perform concerts, big ones. I traveled all over Asia when I was young. People said I was going to be one of the great pianists of my generation. Katie's eyes widened. You were a concert pianist? I was going to be, Margaret corrected. But I gave it up. I chose something else instead. What did you choose? Love, Margaret said simply. I chose love over music, and for 50 years I haven't regretted that choice. Not really, but I also haven't been able to touch a piano. Not until today. Katie sat back in her chair, trying to process this information. A concert pianist, a prodigy who had walked away from everything. And for 5 decades, she had kept this hidden, locked away so deeply that even her neighbors in a retirement community had no idea who she really was. Why today? Katie asked. Why did you play today? Margaret looked at her hands again, turning them over as if examining them for the first time. I don't know, she admitted. When I saw that piano this morning, I told myself to stay away. I've done that for years. Whenever I see a piano, I walk the other direction. But today, something was different. Maybe I'm just tired of running from it. She stood up slowly, steadier now. I should go back to my apartment. I'm sure everyone thinks I'm crazy. No one thinks you're crazy, Katie assured her. They think you're amazing. Margaret smiled sadly. They don't understand. That person who was playing, that wasn't really me. That was someone I used to be. But as she walked toward the door, Katie noticed something. Margaret's steps were different than they usually were. She wasn't hunched over, trying to be small and invisible. Her shoulders were back, her head was up. Whatever had happened at that piano, whatever door had opened, it hadn't closed completely. Not yet. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, her mind replaying the afternoon over and over. Her fingers still tingled with the memory of the keys beneath them. The feeling of the music flowing through her after all these years, it was like finding a part of herself she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed. But with the memory of the music came other memories, ones she had worked hard to keep locked away. She remembered being 4 years old in Shanghai, reaching up to touch the keys of her mother's piano for the first time. The way the sound had made her laugh with pure joy. She remembered her first teacher, a stern woman who had recognized something special in the small girl and had pushed her harder than any child should be pushed. She remembered the hours of practice, her fingers bleeding sometimes, her back aching, but never wanting to stop because the music was everything. By the time she was 10, she was performing in regional competitions. By 12, she was playing with youth orchestras. At 15, she won her first major international competition in Hong Kong, and suddenly the classical music world was talking about her. The prodigy from Shanghai, the next great interpreter of romantic piano music. At 17, she was touring Japan, Korea, Taiwan. At 19, she played with the London Philharmonic. At 20, she recorded her first album. The world had been at her feet. Her future seemed limitless. And then she had met David. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache in her chest. David had been studying engineering at Berkeley when she had come to San Francisco for a performance at the War Memorial Opera House. He had been in the audience. A friend had dragged him there, even though he knew nothing about classical music. After the concert, there had been a reception, and somehow they had ended up talking in a corner for 2 hours. He hadn't cared that she was famous. He hadn't been impressed by her talent or her achievements. He had just liked her, the real her, the girl underneath all the pressure and expectations and endless performances. They had talked about normal things, simple things, what kind of food they liked, what made them laugh, their favorite childhood memories. For the first time in her life, Margaret had felt like she could breathe. They had written letters after she left San Francisco, long letters full of thoughts and dreams and the kind of honesty she had never shared with anyone. 6 months later, she had come back to California for another performance. They had met again, and somewhere in those meetings, she had fallen completely in love with him. When David had asked her to marry him, to stay in America, to build a life together, she had said yes. Just like that. Yes to a quiet life, yes to being ordinary, yes to giving up everything she had worked for since she was 4 years old. Her parents had been furious. They had built their entire lives around her career, had sacrificed everything to support her training and travel. Her mother had screamed at her over a crackling phone line, calling her selfish, ungrateful, foolish. Her father had simply stopped speaking to her altogether. Her younger brother, who she had been close to, had been forbidden from contacting her. The classical music world had been shocked. Articles were written about her decision, most of them critical. Her manager had tried everything to change her mind. Fellow musicians had called her, some understanding, most not. How could she throw away such a gift? How could she be so irresponsible? Didn't she understand what she was walking away from? But Margaret had been sure. She had married David in a small courthouse ceremony with 2 of his friends as witnesses. She had packed up her life, sold her piano, and moved into a small apartment in San Jose. And for 50 years, she had been Mrs. Chen, a wife, a mother to 2 children, a grandmother to 4, a normal person living a normal life. And she had been happy, truly happy. David had been a good man, a kind husband, a wonderful father. They had built something real together, something that had nothing to do with concert halls or reviews or the pressure of perfection. She hadn't regretted her choice, but she also hadn't played piano, not once, not in 50 years. It had been too painful. Every time she saw a piano, it reminded her of 2 things at once, the life she had chosen and the life she had left behind. She couldn't separate those feelings, couldn't find a way to play just for herself, just for joy. So she had simply stopped. David had understood, or at least he had tried to. He had never pushed her to play, never suggested she take it up again as a hobby. He had known, in his quiet way, that it was too complicated for that. And then last year, David had died. A heart attack, sudden and unexpected. One moment he had been reading the newspaper in their living room, and the next moment he was gone. Just like that. 50 years together ended in an instant. Their daughter had suggested the move to Riverside Gardens. Margaret couldn't stay in the house anymore, couldn't bear the emptiness of the rooms where David's presence still lingered in every corner. So she had sold the house, given away most of their belongings, and moved into apartment 2B. She had thought that would be enough. A new place, a fresh start, a way to get through the grief without drowning in it. But instead, she had just felt more alone than ever, cut off from her past, from her children who lived far away with their own busy lives, from everything that had given her life meaning. Until yesterday, until that piano. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the clock on her nightstand. It was 3 in the morning. She got up slowly, her joints stiff, and walked to the small living room. She stood by the window, looking out at the dark grounds of Riverside Gardens. A few lights were on in other buildings. Other people who couldn't sleep, other people carrying their own stories, their own losses, their own regrets. She had told Katie that she didn't regret choosing love over music, and that was true. She didn't regret David or their life together. But standing there in the darkness, she had to admit something else to herself. She did regret losing the music, not the fame or the career or the recognition, but the music itself, the pure joy of creating something beautiful, the feeling of connection to something larger than herself. She had thought she had to choose one or the other, music or love, career or family, her old life or her new life. But maybe that had been wrong. Maybe she could have found a way to keep both. Maybe she didn't have to bury that part of herself so completely. It was too late for those maybes now. She was 72 years old. David was gone. Her career had been over for 5 decades. There was no going back to what might have been. But that piano was still sitting in the community room downstairs, and her fingers still remembered what to do. The next morning, Margaret got dressed carefully. She braided her hair the way she used to before performances, a habit she hadn't indulged in years. She had breakfast, though she barely tasted the food. Then she walked down to the community room. It was early, just after 8. The room was empty. The piano sat in the same spot, waiting. Margaret walked over to it and ran her hand across the smooth surface. She sat down on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys. This time, she didn't start with a simple scale. This time, she dove straight into Debussy's Clair de Lune, one of her favorite pieces from her performing days. The notes flowed out, filling the empty room with moonlight and water and all the beauty she had been holding inside for so long. She didn't know that Katie had arrived early and was standing in the doorway, listening. She didn't know that Mrs. Walsh had come down for her morning walk and had stopped in the hallway, tears in her eyes again. She didn't know that several other early risers were gathering quietly in the room, not wanting to interrupt, just wanting to hear. Margaret played on, lost in the music, finally allowing herself to feel everything she had been holding back. The grief over David, the loss of her family in China, the complicated mixture of peace and regret that came with the choices she had made. All of it poured into the music, making it richer and deeper than it had ever been when she was young. When she finished, she opened her eyes and saw the small crowd. This time, she didn't look startled or frightened. This time, she smiled. A real smile. The first one anyone at Riverside Gardens had ever seen from her. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, Margaret's story had traveled beyond the walls of Riverside Gardens. Katie had mentioned it to her roommate, who happened to be a music student at the local university. The roommate had told her professor. The professor, an elderly woman named Dr. Helena Voss, had been teaching piano for 40 years and thought she had heard every story there was to hear. But this one made her stop in her tracks. Dr. Voss sat in her office at the university, listening to her student describe what had happened. A 72-year-old woman in a retirement home. Used to be a concert pianist, hadn't played in 50 years. The student didn't know many details, but the way Katie had described the performance made it sound extraordinary. "Do you remember her name?" Dr. Voss asked, though she suspected it was a long shot. There had been so many talented pianists over the decades. Most faded into obscurity. The student checked her phone where she had written it down. Margaret Chen. But I think that might be her married name. Dr. Voss went very still. Chen, she repeated slowly. Did Katie mention where she was from originally? Shanghai, I think. She said something about performing in Asia back in the 70s. Dr. Voss stood up and walked to her bookshelf, Her fingers traced along the spines of old programs and albums until she found what she was looking for. A concert program from 1973, Tokyo. She opened it carefully, the paper yellowed with age. There, on the third page, was a photograph of a young woman at a piano. Elegant, serious, impossibly talented. The name printed below read, Margaret Zhang. "My God," Dr. Voss whispered. "I saw her perform. I was there." She had been a young pianist herself back then, studying in Japan, struggling with whether she had what it took to make it professionally. She had gone to that concert and had been completely mesmerized. Margaret Zhang had played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with such power and emotion that half the audience had been in tears by the end. Dr. Voss remembered leaving that concert hall feeling both inspired and devastated, knowing she would never be able to play like that. And then Margaret Zhang had disappeared. One day she was everywhere, the rising star of classical piano, and the next she was simply gone. No more performances, no more recordings, just rumors that she had moved to America and left music behind. Dr. Voss had thought about her over the years, wondering what had happened. How could someone with that much talent just walk away? Now, apparently, she was about to find out. 2 days later, Dr. Voss stood outside apartment 2B at Riverside Gardens. Katie had arranged the meeting, though she wasn't sure how Margaret would react. The older woman had been playing every morning in the community room, drawing larger crowds each time, but she still kept to herself otherwise. Margaret answered the door in a simple cardigan and slacks, her hair pulled back in her usual braid. She looked at Dr. Voss with polite confusion. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Voss began, her voice unsteady with emotion. "I don't know if this will mean anything to you, but I saw you perform in Tokyo in 1973. You played Rachmaninoff. I was 23 years old, and it changed my life." Margaret's expression shifted. Surprise, then recognition, then something more complicated. She stepped back from the door. "You should come in." They sat in Margaret's small living room, tea growing cold between them as they talked. Dr. Voss explained who she was, how that concert had affected her, how she had always wondered what happened to the brilliant young pianist who had vanished from the classical music world. Margaret listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When Dr. Voss finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't think anyone remembered," Margaret finally said. "It's been so long." "People remember," Dr. Voss assured her. "There are recordings of some of your performances floating around. Students still study them. You were extraordinary." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I was young. I was technically skilled, but I don't know if I really understood what I was playing back then. I was just doing what I was trained to do." "That's not what I heard," Dr. Voss said gently. "What I heard was someone who felt every note, someone who understood the music in a way that most of us never will." "Maybe," Margaret said softly, "but I gave it up for a reason. I needed to have a real life. A normal life. And did you? Have a good life, I mean?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "I did. My husband was wonderful. We had 2 beautiful children, 4 grandchildren now. I don't regret any of that." "But you regret losing the music." It wasn't a question. Dr. Voss could see it in the way Margaret's fingers moved unconsciously, as if playing invisible keys, in the way her eyes went distant when she talked about those years. "I thought I had to choose," Margaret admitted. "Music or family, career or love. I didn't see how I could have both. Not the way my life was structured back then. The touring, the constant performances, the pressure. I was so tired. And when I met David, he offered me something I had never had before. Peace. The chance to just be myself." "Do you think you made the wrong choice?" "No," Margaret said firmly. I made the right choice for who I was then. But maybe I was wrong to shut music out completely. I thought it had to be all or nothing. I see now that maybe it didn't. Dr. Voss leaned forward. I came here to tell you how much your music meant to me all those years ago. But I also came to ask you something. Would you consider performing again? Just once, a small recital at the university. Nothing like what you used to do. Just you, a piano, and people who would appreciate hearing you play. Margaret's eyes widened. Oh, I couldn't. I'm not that person anymore. My technique isn't what it was. I haven't practiced in any serious way in decades. I heard you play this morning, Dr. Voss said. Katie had called her when Margaret started playing, and she had arrived in time to hear the last piece. What you did this morning was more moving than most professional performances I've attended in the last 10 years. You don't play like you used to. You play better. That's not possible. It's true. You have something now that you didn't have when you were young. Experience, loss, life. It's all there in the music. Every note you play has depth that only comes from really living. Margaret stood up and walked to the window. Outside, residents were walking along the paths, sitting on benches, living out their quiet days. She had been one of them just a week ago, invisible and content to remain that way. I'm scared, she admitted, without turning around. What if I can't do it? What if my hands give out or my memory fails? What if I embarrass myself? Then you embarrass yourself, Dr. Voss said simply. But I don't think that will happen. And even if it did, would it really be worse than never trying? Than spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Margaret turned back to face her. When would this recital be? 2 months. That gives you time to practice, to prepare. We'll keep it small. Just the university concert hall. Maybe 100 people. 100 people, Margaret repeated, and despite her fear, there was a hint of something else in her voice. Excitement, possibility. You don't have to decide right now, Dr. Voss said, standing. Think about it. Talk to your family if you want. But Margaret, I hope you'll do it. The world deserves to hear you play again, and I think you deserve to play again too. After Dr. Voss left, Margaret sat alone in her apartment for a long time. She thought about David, about what he would say if he were here. She thought he would encourage her. He had always wanted her to be happy, to be whole. He had understood, even if she hadn't, that giving up music completely had taken something vital from her. She thought about her children, now grown with families of their own. They had never heard her play seriously. They knew she had been a pianist once, but it was just a fact about her past, like where she had gone to school or what street she had grown up on. They didn't know what it had meant, what it still meant. And she thought about herself, about the girl who had fallen in love with music at 4 years old, about the young woman who had chosen love over fame, about the widow who had spent 6 months trying to be invisible, and about the person she might still become, if she was brave enough to try. That evening, Margaret went down to the community room and played for 2 straight hours. Her fingers ached when she finished, unused to the strain. But it was a good ache, the kind that meant she was building something, becoming something. Katie watched from the doorway, smiling. Margaret was coming back to life. The next 2 months passed in a blur of music and memory. Margaret practiced every day, sometimes for hours at a time. Her fingers, stiff and uncertain at first, gradually remembered their old strength. The calluses that had faded decades ago began to return. Her back ached from sitting at the piano, but it was the kind of ache that felt purposeful, earned. She called her daughter Christine one evening. It was a difficult conversation to start. How do you tell your children about a part of yourself they never really knew? Mom, I don't understand, Christine had said, confusion clear in her voice. You're going to perform, like on a stage, in front of people? I know it sounds strange, Margaret had replied, but yes, just once. There's something I need to do. But why now, after all these years? Margaret had thought about how to answer that. Because I'm running out of time to make peace with the choices I made. And because I want you and your brother to see who I was before I became your mother. Who I still am underneath everything. Christine had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We'll be there. Daniel and I. We'll both come." Margaret's son called the next day. Daniel had always been the more emotional of her two children, more like her in temperament. "Mom," he said, his voice thick, "why didn't you ever tell us? Why didn't you play for us when we were growing up?" "I couldn't," Margaret said honestly. "It hurt too much. Every time I thought about it, I felt like I was being torn in two. The person I had been and the person I became. I didn't know how to be both. And now you do?" "No," Margaret admitted. "But I'm learning. And I'm tired of pretending that part of me never existed." The practice sessions at Riverside Gardens became daily events. Residents would gather in the community room every afternoon, sitting quietly while Margaret worked through difficult passages, made mistakes, started over. They saw her frustration when her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They saw her joy when a piece finally came together. They were witnessing something rare, someone rediscovering a lost part of themselves. Mrs. Walsh brought her lunch one day so she wouldn't have to stop practicing. Mr. Peterson, who had played that shaky version of Jingle Bells all those weeks ago, started showing up with a notebook, writing down the names of the pieces Margaret played so he could look them up later. Katie made sure the piano was tuned and the room was available whenever Margaret needed it. They had become her unlikely support system, these people who had barely known her 2 months ago. But Margaret was also terrified. Some nights she would wake up in a panic, her heart racing, thinking about standing on that stage. What if she froze? What if her memory failed in the middle of a piece? What if people expected the prodigy from 1973 and got a 72-year-old woman whose best years were long behind her? Dr. Voss visited regularly, listening to her practice, offering gentle guidance. "You're thinking too much," she would say. "Stop trying to play like you used to. Play like who you are now." "Who am I now?" Margaret asked one afternoon, frustrated after stumbling through the same passage for the 10th time. "You're someone who knows what it means to love and lose," Dr. Voss said. "Someone who made hard choices and lived with them. Someone who gave up everything for something she valued more. That's who you are. Let that come through in the music." The night before the recital, Margaret couldn't eat dinner. She sat in her apartment, staring at the clothes she had laid out for tomorrow. A simple black dress, elegant, but not flashy. Not the elaborate gowns she used to wear on stage. She was a different person now. Her phone rang. It was Christine. "Mom, we're here. Daniel and I are at the hotel. The kids wanted to come too, so we brought them. I hope that's okay." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Her grandchildren. They were going to hear her play. They were going to see this part of her that she had kept hidden for so long. "That's more than okay," Margaret whispered. "That's perfect." The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. She got dressed slowly, braided her hair with hands that shook slightly. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked nervous, yes, but also alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Katie drove her to the university. The concert hall was smaller than the grand venues Margaret remembered from her youth, but it was beautiful. Wood paneling, excellent acoustics, a gorgeous grand piano on the stage. Dr. Voss was already there, making sure everything was perfect. "How are you feeling?" she asked Margaret. "Like I might throw up," Margaret said honestly. Dr. Voss laughed. "That's normal. Even the best performers get nervous. It means you care." People started arriving an hour before the recital was scheduled to start. Margaret watched from backstage, peeking through the curtain. She saw her children walk in, Christine holding hands with her daughter, Daniel with his 2 boys. She saw the residents from Riverside Gardens filing in, Mrs. Walsh and Mr. Peterson and Katie and so many others. She saw music students, professors, people she didn't know who had simply heard about this performance and wanted to be there. By the time the lights dimmed, every seat was filled. More than 100 people, closer to 200, all of them waiting to hear her play. Dr. Voss gave a brief introduction. She spoke about Margaret's career in the 70s, about the choice she had made to leave it all behind, about the 5 decades of silence that had followed. And then she spoke about what it meant that Margaret was here now, willing to share her gift again after all this time. Music, Dr. Voss said, is not just about technical perfection, it's about truth. And tonight, you're going to hear someone play with more truth than most of us ever managed to access. Please welcome Margaret Chen. Margaret walked onto the stage. The applause was warm, encouraging. She saw her family in the third row, Christine already crying. She saw Katie giving her a thumbs up. She saw strangers looking at her with curiosity and kindness. She sat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she was back in Tokyo in 1973, young and fearless and ready to conquer the world. But then she blinked, and she was here now, 72 years old, carrying 5 decades of life in her heart. She began to play. She had chosen Chopin's Nocturne first, the same piece that had started everything at Riverside Gardens. But this time she played it differently, slower, more deliberate. She let every note breathe, let every phrase speak to the life she had lived, the love she had found, the losses she had endured, the choices she had made. The audience sat in absolute silence, transfixed. She moved to Debussy, then to a Rachmaninoff prelude that had always been one of her favorites. Her fingers flew across the keys, not with the aggressive perfection of youth, but with the understanding that only comes from really living. She made a few small mistakes, but they didn't matter. This wasn't about perfection anymore. This was about truth. For her final piece, she played Schumann's Träumerei, or Dreaming. It was short, simple, one of the most beautiful pieces ever written. She had played it at her very first recital when she was 6 years old, and now she played it again, at possibly her last. When the final notes faded, there was a long moment of silence. Then the audience rose to their feet, applauding so hard the sound filled the entire hall. Margaret stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face. She looked out at all those people, at her children who were sobbing, at the residents from Riverside Gardens who were cheering like she had just won the Olympics. She had spent 50 years thinking she had to choose between music and love, between her gift and her life. But standing there on that stage, she finally understood. She hadn't given up music for love. She had given up fame, yes. She had given up a career, but the music had always been inside her. She had just been too afraid to let it out. Later, at a small reception, her grandchildren clustered around her. "Grandma, that was amazing," her oldest grandson said. "I didn't know you could do that." "Neither did I," Margaret admitted with a laugh. "Not anymore, at least." Christine hugged her tightly. "Thank you for letting us see this part of you. I wish we had known sooner." "I wish I had shown you sooner," Margaret said. "But maybe this was the right time. Maybe I needed to live all those years before I could play like that." Dr. Voss approached with a woman Margaret didn't recognize. "Margaret, this is the director of our summer concert series. She'd like to talk to you about possibly doing more performances." Margaret looked at the piano across the room, then at her family. Then at Katie and the others from Riverside Gardens, who had become her friends. She thought about her small apartment, her quiet life, the person she had been just 2 months ago. And she smiled. "Let's talk," she said. Because Margaret Chen had spent 50 years being one person, and that had been enough. It had been good. But now, For whatever time she had left, she was ready to be whole, to be both the woman who had chosen love and the musician who had never really stopped hearing the music. She was ready to finally be herself,